Dear listeners, I have so much to tell you, and I often don't know where to start. It seems the world doesn't want to admit that sometimes we make mistakes and that sometimes the wrong person gets punished for something they didn't do. Not all of us have been personally affected, but many of us have been impacted by this reality. And I feel like it's my responsibility to share these stories with you and to tell you what I've learned about wrongful convictions. I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey through the world of wrongful convictions. Whether you've been with me from the very first episode or you're just recently tuning in, I'm so grateful that you're here. Talking about this topic isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. And at this point in the podcast, it feels really important to me to pause, to take a breath, and to reflect on the things that we've learned, the things that we've felt, and how we can carry that forward together. As I had mentioned early on, this podcast was born from a desire to do more than present facts or statistics. It was about creating a space where stories could take shape and come to life. It's a space where lived experience can take center stage and not be reduced to footnotes in legal textbooks or passing comments. We've talked about the repercussions of willful bias, about prosecutorial misconduct, about the ripple effects of a flawed system. But we've also talked about hope and advocacy and the relentless push for justice, even when the odds seem impossible. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have been provided the opportunity not only to host these conversations, but also to share them. I've always said that I'm forever grateful to the Innocence community for welcoming me in with open arms and with a willingness to share their stories with me, because this is not a lived experience that I share. Because of that, I've always been acutely aware of my position in this world, and I always keep that at the fore of my mind when having these conversations. It's not my intention to glorify or to debase their stories because they're not mine to shape. They're theirs to tell. My role is to listen, to learn, and to help create a space where these voices can be heard on their own terms. Every story shared with me is a gift. And I work really hard to treat it with the care, the respect, and the responsibility it deserves. And so, with that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and to thank the remarkable guests who have joined us so far on this journey. So, Jamie Nelson's willingness to revisit the most painful chapters of his life, the injustice of his wrongful conviction, the isolation of incarceration, and the ongoing challenges of rebuilding after exoneration is nothing short of extraordinary. As one of my closest friends and strongest allies, I couldn't think of a better voice to kick things off with. His story set the tone for this podcast because his isn't just a story about injustice. It's one of incredible human strength, resilience, and the power of perseverance. Jamie's experience reminds us that wrongful convictions aren't only legal failures. They're deeply human tragedies that demand our attention, our empathy, and our action. Shauna's voice brings a powerful, often unheard perspective, that of the sibling, the witness, the supporter. Through her eyes, we're given a unique chance to understand the secondary trauma experienced by families, the invisible grief of watching a loved one suffer, and the love that endures across prison walls and years of silence. Her insight underscores the reality that wrongful convictions ripple far beyond the individual. They touch everyone who loves them. Together, Jamie and Shauna offered Wrongfully Yours something invaluable: a foundation of trust, of truth, and of emotional depth. Their stories were not only essential to launch this podcast, but they're also a reminder of why we tell these stories. To Jamie and Shauna, I cannot thank you enough, not only for being my friends, but because your strength gives voice to so many others who are still waiting to be heard. Our next guest, Mark Beach, brought a unique and deeply valuable perspective to our conversation, one that few others can offer. As a veteran police officer, Mark spent decades inside the very system we so often critique. He's seen the inner workings of law enforcement from the front lines, and he knows firsthand both the ideals that draw people to the profession and the institutional realities that can slowly erode these ideals. What made Mark's contribution so powerful wasn't just his candor about the challenges within policing, it was his willingness to engage in self reflection and systemic critique from within. He spoke honestly about how tunnel vision, bias, and pressure can shape investigations, and how easy it can be for even well meaning officers to lose sight of their duty to seek truth, not just convictions. But Mark didn't stop at reflection. He's taken that experience and used it to build something transformative. He now serves as the director of the Wrongful Conviction Awareness Training Program, a groundbreaking initiative that is now mandated in the state of Illinois. Through his role, Mark is helping to educate current and future law enforcement professionals, challenging them to think critically about investigative integrity, confirmation bias, and the long term consequences of error. What stood out in our conversation was his insistence that accountability and reform are not threats to good policing, they are its foundation. Mark reminded us that justice is not served when we protect the system from scrutiny. Justice is served when we protect people from being swallowed by its failures. His unique dual vantage point as someone who has both enforced the law and now works to confront its deepest flaws offers an invaluable bridge between two often polarized worlds. And in doing so, he made it clear that preventing wrongful convictions is not just a legal issue, it's a cultural one. It requires changing how we train, how we lead, how we investigate, and perhaps most importantly, how we listen. And for that, and for his continued commitment to truth and transformation, I am so deeply grateful. Our next guest, Eric Anderson, had a story that is as shocking as it is illuminating. His case is a stunning example of how quickly innocence can be ignored and how easily the system can go from being a protector to being a persecutor. As a 20-year-old college student with dreams of becoming a computer engineer, Eric was shot in a random act of violence, inexplicably found himself misidentified, arrested, and wrongfully convicted for a crime he did not commit. From that moment on, he was plunged into a nightmare of mistaken identity, flawed procedures, and systemic failures. His willingness to relive this injustice and to walk us through the disbelief, fear, and betrayal he experienced at the hands of the justice system is a powerful act of bravery. But his story isn't just one of victimization, it's also one of resolve. Eric's contribution to Wrongfully Yours extends far beyond his personal story of wrongful conviction. Through each chapter of his journey, his refusal to accept a false plea, his relentless self advocacy from behind prison bars, and his eventual exoneration, Eric models radical resilience and integrity. He shows us what it means to hold on to truth in a system designed to strip it away. By refusing a plea deal that could have granted his freedom at the cost of his truth, by teaching himself the law, and by ultimately regaining his freedom through the Michigan Innocence Clinic and the Wayne County Conviction Integrity Unit, Eric demonstrated an extraordinary strength of spirit. And he didn't stop there. In sharing the final part of his story, his life after exoneration, Eric reveals what happens after exoneration, the often overlooked challenges of reentry, rebuilding, and redefining purpose. Rather than retreating from the system that harmed him, Eric chose to confront it head on. He now works to support other exonerees, educate the next generation of lawyers and police officers, and advocate for systemic reform so that others don't have to endure what he did. In sharing this with us, Eric offers something rare and deeply valuable, a vision of purpose beyond survival. And he reminds us that the fight for justice doesn't end with release. It continues in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities. So, Eric, thank you for your generosity, your integrity, and your vision. Your story isn't only essential listening, it's a call to action. And I am so honored to have had the chance to amplify your voice. And I am forever grateful for the opportunity to learn from your experience and your leadership. Next up were the representatives of the Dallas Conviction Integrity Unit, Mike Ware and James Hammond. Together, they brought something truly rare and deeply important to this conversation. A glimpse into what it looks like when a prosecutorial office doesn't just seek convictions, but is also committed to correcting its mistakes. As the architects of the first conviction integrity unit in the United States, Mike and James have spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the political, institutional, and emotional terrain of post conviction work from inside the very system that got it wrong. That work is anything but easy, and yet they continue to show up for it case after case, year after year. What struck me most in our conversation wasn't just the groundbreaking nature of what they helped build in Dallas. It was their clarity about the stakes, that wrongful convictions are not just individual tragedies, but rather they are systemic failures that require systemic accountability. They spoke openly about the resistance they face, the heartbreak they witness, and the determination it takes to keep going when the truth is inconvenient or unwelcome. For Canadian listeners, this episode offered something we rarely get: a look into a model that we don't have, but that we could arguably benefit from. Mike and James reminded us that integrity in the justice system isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about what happens after. It's about owning our failures, correcting them, and building structures that make that correction possible. Their willingness to share their journey, honestly, critically, and with real humility, was a gift to this podcast and to everyone who cares about the possibility of justice. I'm deeply grateful to both of them, not just for their time, but for the path that they've cleared and for the example that they've set. Then we had the opportunity to speak with the students who have formed the group Pen for Justice. And they are an inspirational and highly motivated student group who reminded us that this work is so very urgent, that every day somebody waits behind bars, behind bureaucracy, behind indifference. Their words were a call to action, to remember those whose stories we haven't yet heard, and to push for reforms that reach beyond release to restoration. Their message cut through traditional legal jargon and rhetoric to remind us of something fundamental: that while we speak about wrongful convictions, there are people living the consequences right now, and many of them don't have the privilege of access, platform, or support. What makes this group so compelling is the clarity of its purpose and the energy behind its actions. This isn't a group waiting for permission to speak. They are actively creating space for critical conversations in classrooms, on campuses, and in public forums. And they're talking about innocence, incarceration, and accountability. In a legal culture that so often prizes seniority and deference to established voices, Pen for Justice challenges that hierarchy. They remind us that young people are not just future lawyers or policymakers. They are current stakeholders in the fight for justice. And their questions often cut to the core. Questions like, why do wrongful convictions persist? Who benefits from the presumption of guilt? What does meaningful accountability look like beyond the courtroom? The students behind Pen for Justice are part of a growing movement that refuses to treat wrongful convictions as isolated incidents. They understand these cases not just as legal anomalies, but as a system built on racialized suspicion, uneven access to resources, and deeply entrenched institutional inertia. I'm incredibly grateful for the presence of Pen for Justice in this podcast. Their work reminds us that justice isn't just about revisiting past wrongs. It's about preventing future ones. And that begins with education and with the belief that another kind of system is possible, one that's rooted in care and equity and collective accountability. We then heard from Jeff Deskovic, who shared not only his story, but his heart. In our conversation, Jeff spoke not only with clarity and conviction, but with deep emotional intelligence. He shared what it means to lose your youth, your identity, and your future to a system that refuses to admit error. But he also spoke about hope, not in a naive way, but in a grounded, hard earned kind of way. He reminded us that hope is not passive, it's an act of resistance. Jeff's insight cuts through legal jargon and academic theory. He brings us face to face with the human cost of systemic failure. And in doing so, he challenges all of us lawyers, journalists, students, judges, advocates, anyone to ask harder questions and to do better. What struck me most about Jeff was his unflinching belief in the power of justice, even after everything he's endured. That belief isn't abstract. It's personal. It's forged through pain, refined through reflection, and wielded in service of others. To hear Jeff speak is to be reminded that wrongful convictions aren't just legal anomalies, they're human tragedies. And that it's not enough to feel sympathy. We have to channel that empathy into action, reform, and sustained public pressure. Jeff's story isn't just one of survival, it's one of transformation. And it's a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, purpose can emerge. His voice is a cornerstone of this podcast, and I am profoundly grateful to have had the opportunity to share this space with him. After speaking with Jeff, I was given the unique opportunity to sit down with his fiancée, Samantha. This was a heartfelt conversation that offered something truly rare: hope. Samantha was gracious enough to share her experience of meeting Jeff, learning about his path, and then choosing to walk alongside him in life and in the work of justice. It's not often that we hear from the partners of exonerees, the people who come into their lives after the headlines fade, and who see them not for what they've been through, but for who they are. This conversation should serve to remind us that wrongful convictions don't just steal the past, they reshape what's possible in the future. Through Samantha's story, we see what it looks like when possibility, love, and purpose align. And for that, Samantha, I thank you for sharing so openly with us. The impact of these conversations is, in many ways, too far reaching to be able to fully capture. Each guest brought something unique, something vital to the table. Together, they created a medley of insight and experience and critique that challenges us to think differently about justice, innocence, and accountability. And to each of my guests, I cannot thank you enough. Your courage, your vulnerability, and your insight have helped to make this podcast what it is. As different as these conversations were, I keep coming back to a single difficult truth. Wrongful convictions are not isolated mistakes. They're systemic, they're patterned, and they're often preventable. And yet, prevention remains elusive because of the mechanisms that produce these injustices, and because they're so deeply embedded in how we define truth and credibility and expertise. We've heard how evidence gets dismissed, how lawyers miss connections, how courts sometimes rely on questionable evidence. And we've also heard how trust, persistence, and sometimes sheer luck help uncover what should have never been buried in the first place. These conversations matter. They matter because they help us see the human side of the legal system, and because they help us question the assumption that the system, by default, gets it right. So I think that brings us all to an important question. Where do we go from here? We'll continue to explore the complexities of wrongful convictions. We'll examine the legal mechanisms that fail, the cultural narratives that shape belief, and the innovations that offer hope for change. We'll continue to talk to exonerees, defense lawyers, police officers, activists, and really anyone else who wants to share their story, because they're the ones who are working behind the scenes to change what justice looks like in practice. We'll talk about the factors that we know contribute to wrongful convictions, and we'll ask uncomfortable questions about the legal profession itself. And we'll keep returning to one key idea: how do we prevent wrongful convictions and not just respond to them after the fact? And while these may seem like lofty aspirations, our conversations to date suggest to me that these goals are not unattainable. I want to invite you, the listeners, to be part of them. Whether you're a lawyer, a student, a survivor, a policymaker, or simply someone like me who cares, there's room for you in this conversation. So, if you're working in the justice system, if you've experienced injustice firsthand, or if you're just starting to learn about these issues, I'd love to hear from you. Together, we can keep asking hard questions and keep pushing for a justice system that lives up to its name. So before I sign off, I want to return to the heart of why we're here. Talking about wrongful convictions isn't just about recounting legal missteps or dissecting the failures of legal actors. It's about acknowledging that these errors aren't abstract. They're lived, and they're felt, and they leave scars. When someone is wrongfully convicted, it's not just one person who suffers. It's their families, their friends, their children, their community, and ultimately, the integrity of the system itself. Every wrongful conviction is an indictment of how we assign guilt, how we understand truth, and how power is distributed in our legal institutions. These are not comfortable truths, but they're necessary ones to examine. That's why this podcast isn't just about storytelling. It's about truth-telling. And truth-telling, as we've seen, is both powerful and risky. It requires vulnerability from those who speak and openness from those who listen. It demands that we resist easy answers and instead sit with complexity. I've heard the word resilience used a lot when we talk about exonerees. And to be completely honest, I use the term often in this context as well. And while resilience is real and worthy of honor, I also want to acknowledge the inherent unfairness of needing that kind of resilience in the first place. No one should have to endure years of incarceration just to prove their innocence. No one should have to fight that hard within a justice system to see what should have been visible all along. And yet, people do. They keep showing up in courtrooms, in advocacy spaces, in classrooms, and on podcasts like this one. They keep telling their stories, not because they owe it to us, but because they believe that something better is possible. And that is one of the most important lessons I've learned from the conversations we've had so far. A belief that change is possible, but only if we're willing to examine the system we take for granted and to hear from the people it's harmed. That means that this podcast is, in some ways, a small act of resistance of its own. It's a refusal to let these stories be forgotten. It's a space where pain and injustice can be named, but it's also a space where hope and accountability can grow. I am all too aware that this work is heavy, but it's also hopeful, because every time a story is told, a false narrative loses ground. And every time a truth is acknowledged, justice inches forward. So, as we move forward together, I invite you to stay engaged. Don't let this be the episode where you pause and then move on. Let it be the moment where something settles in and stays with you. Ask yourself, what role do I play in this? What can I learn? What can I change? There's a reason we use the word journey when we talk about this work, because confronting wrongful convictions is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. It's a process of listening, of learning, of holding space for pain, and for pushing for accountability. So again, thank you for being here, for making space, for choosing to listen, even when it's uncomfortable. And thank you for believing that justice must be fought for, not just in the courtrooms, but in everyday acts of attention, compassion, and truth-telling. And while today's letter may have piqued your interest, this is only part of the story. There's still so much more to tell. The effects of wrongful convictions are far-reaching. They touch us all. I'll write to you again soon as I continue my conversations with those whose lives have been impacted by a wrongful conviction. But until then, I remain wrongfully yours. And if today's episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it with others, liking and following the podcast on your favorite platforms so you don't miss what comes next. And as always, thank you for listening to Wrongfully Yours, where we believe that telling these stories is the first step towards preventing the next injustice. And until next time, stay curious, stay hopeful, and keep fighting for justice. If you have something that you want to talk about with me, or even if you want to just send me some words of encouragement, you can drop me a line at wrongfullyyourspodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out my website, kellylauzon.ca, for more information about me and the kinds of things that I do.